To the north, at this same time during the 1070s, Catholic merchants from Milano and Capua had done good business with Novgorod, and the missionaries they brought were thusly positively associated, and so Novgorod began its conversion to Catholicism. This was in decidedly stark contrast to the Albigensian chaplains who came bearing nothing but demands and extreme societal overhaul. Some at the court of Novgorod would come to say they earned their deaths via their presumptions and hubris. Meanwhile, the Catholics' true path to entry into the spiritual market there was via Tsar Ivan IV. He was struck with epilepsy since childhood, and it had been getting worse since his ascension. He would sacrifice at the altars of his gods, slaughter his finest beasts, toss treasures into rivers and barrows, and even etch runes on his skin with a sharp knife. Regardless, his gods had seemed to have abandoned him, and his condition grew yet more severe. One day, after a particularly bad fit had caused his wife to flee in terror of him and his condition which nobody understood, he was intent on walking into the forest and wandering there until he dropped dead. On his second day of wandering, he collapsed, and on the third day, still unconscious, he was found by a band of Catholic monks who were sent north to accompany a trade mission. They took care of him and carried him back to his court. He found their prayers and rituals soothing, and the whole time he was with them his heart was calm and his mind was clear. Upon his return, he forsook the gods of his fathers and became a Catholic, even going so far as to grant land to the Teutonic Order. There were some revolts, but his absolute authority over Novgorod was something which could not yet be legitimately challenged. Yet another clear victory for the Catholics, much to the chagrin of the Albigensian Church. Meanwhile, in 1073, the Viking chief Skofte and his host invaded the Volksreich near Jutland, bringing nearly 4,000 invaders with him. Not simply a raider, he declared his intention to seize the entire realm by force, made eminently clear by the caliber of his band of thieves and robbers. They were also set apart from their roving brothers by the inclusion of minor siege engines, which were a great trouble for them to transport. Catapults were intended to be the crux upon which their great conquest hinged. Despite their grand claims, during their time in the Volksreich they would be little more than a nuisance. This was the result of the fact that they were not proficient or trained in the use of their siege equipment, and their ships were not equipped to transport the small number that they were able to utilize. On the 8th of April, 1073, the late Patriarch Iiutbalt was canonized as an Albigensian saint for his leadership of the faithful, known forevermore as Saint Liutbalt the Confessor. Meanwhile, with the plague raging and the bodies piling up in the streets, rumors of witchcraft began to circulate throughout the Volksreich, and 2 members of court were accused. One was Lord Grummwald, who did not attend church, constantly at odds with the clergy, and was therefore burned at the stake for suspicion. The other was Lady Banhilde, who was a well-known herbalist who sold her services to those who were of need. She was imprisoned. These actions soothed the people's fears to some degree. This didn't sit well with Kaiser Hermann, but despite the powers which are the privilege of his royal title, he could not contend with the rabid fears of the people he ruled over. Meanwhile, the Viking army to the north continued their scourging of Jutland, as they were stuck there, and when Volkish commanders were finally able to muster nearly 7,000 men that weren't sick or dying, they set out on their journey. The commanders of this Volkish army were inexperienced, but were also the few that hadn't secluded themselves in their keeps and castles in an attempt to cheat death. The battle was worryingly close, and the battle line sank partially into a swamp when the invaders mounted a false retreat. But, ultimately, the Vikings were pushed back into the sea, their catapults seized and destroyed. On the 22nd of December, 1073, another one of Hermann's sisters, Sara, who was without title but still wildly ambitious, followed in her elder sister's footsteps. She was always envious of her sister, as well as her brother, and for most of her life, Sara felt forgotten. Now she found herself in that long-desired niche through which she could reinvent herself. She contacted her sister's old friends and allies at court who were unsatisfied with Hermann's rule and became ingratiated with their court faction, turning the gears in their treacherous machine in order to install herself as Kaiserin. War was declared on her 13-year-old brother through that court faction agitating for her rule. Time would tell if this shift in focus would be a prudent investment for the men and women of her late sister's court faction. Regarding the revolt, there were not nearly enough fighting men to handle this insurrection, as what was left of the main Volkish force was assaulted and completely decimated. Sara raised 16,000 men to overthrow her brother, shattering the Volksreich into civil war. Landed lords, counts, and commanders across the entire realm drew their lines on the sand, laying down ugly, meandering battle lines through which they planned to spill each other's blood. Loyalty to the Child King was a noble but seemingly foolish endeavor, some of the more poetically minded courtiers calling it a sacrifice. In a desperate attempt to hold on to his throne, Kaiser Hermann hired as many mercenaries as the treasury could handle, raising in total 11,000 fighters. The entire Volksreich was thrown into further chaos, combatants switching sides, whole towns and villages caught up in the fray and immolated, certain regions totally deprived of life between the plague and this terrible war. Sara was famously and singularly intent on deposing her younger sibling. Some of the more notable battles that took place during this war were the Peninsular battles, which took place in the largely loyalist Italian peninsula, save for the Alps. These were characterized by unusually stationary battles, due to the long, snaking corridor which the Volksreich owned there. Many armies were bottlenecked and decimated there, and so they noted the region as a theater all its own. Another significant group of battles were the Eastern Struggles, which were named so as they took place in the flat eastern plains that bordered Prussia. Here was the exact opposite of the Peninsular battles, as due to the flatness of the Eastern European plain, fighting in this rebel stronghold was highly mobile, focusing on cavalry skirmishes and archer volleys instead of infantry or even siege tactics. Despite the sheer variety of theaters in which fighting took place, as the months passed it became more and more clear that drastic measures would be needed to preserve Hermann's rule as Kaiser. In a final attempt at survival, Kaiser Hermann scraped together what was left of his armies and headed for the provisional capital of the revolt in the Alps, hoping to kill his sister in the process. The march was long and grueling, devastating his numbers, but as he saw the mountains on the horizon, he was intercepted before he even got close, his men swiftly defeated. On the 2nd of July, 1075, Kaiserine Sara ascended to the throne of the Volksreich at the age of 21, leaving for her brother the title of Lombardia as a show of mercy, for which many praised her. King Hermann of Lombardia was nothing like the Kaiser Hermann of the Volksreich. As Kaiser, he was nervous and without a great deal of character. During the war, he developed this character, and the decisiveness which would have saved him had he developed it earlier. Now, reduced and humiliated, he felt broken. He spent his time poring over the deeds of his ancestors and wept. His purpose was stolen from him. Briefly, he tried to contact loyalists within the court, but just shy of a week in, he found his allies dead, executed by the Kaiserine. She sent him a note, which reminded him of his fate as a living trophy. On the 10th of July, 1076, late at night in Verona, King Hermann of Lombardia sat staring out at the calm waters of the Adriatic, full moon glinting off the metal of the knife he was using to turn the pages of his family's deeds. He was running out of pages. As he shut the book and breathed a heavy sigh of salty ocean air, he plunged that knife into his heart, dying by his window at the age of 15, after little more than a year in his station. His funeral was modest, and he was not interred in the catacombs with his predecessors, instead buried on the grounds of Verona's main church, the Church of Sister Gerland the Martyr. In one of the true paradoxes of history, the people of Verona, though not meant to love him, were regardless endeared to him. They saw his tragic story unfold, witnessed how his short regional rule was a good and honest one, and so the people of the city would remember him where his sister refused to. As this pity progressed, it eventually evolved, over the course of years and decades, and eventually even centuries, into a mournful adoration. They put his name in their sermons, they named streets and alleyways after him, made charms out of his coins, and even put his likeness next to the saints. For whatever reason, Verona made Kaiser Hermann like one of their own. Despite attempts to crush this adoration from Kaiserine Sara and others further along in history, Verona would stubbornly persist in their devotion to their king, the tragedy of his tale acquiring a certain local legend as many moons passed above his grave and the salty air blew across his headstone.